Hi, NASCAR fantasy racing fans. I'm Charlie Turner, and I'm joined with my friend Dan Beaver to do Dan's NASCAR fantasy racing pit stop this week for the big race at Phoenix International Raceway this coming weekend. Hey, Dan, how are you down in Texas today?
I'm doing great. It's a little gray, but that's winter. So
Yeah, it looks like early November here in Toledo today. It's very dreary and cold and rainy and it's just yuck. Wish I was going to be in Phoenix this weekend. I think. Yeah, this race. I am not as you know, and anybody that's watched me over the years knows I'm not a fantasy racing expert. I am a follower of the sport though, and I think I know a little bit about what's going on. But I have to tell you honestly, I have no stinking clue what's going to happen or what to expect this week, this race, based on what happened this past weekend at Texas, where we are with this being the last race of the eliminator round of the chase. I know that it has to affect what's going to happen in this race, and I'm stumped. So take it away, oh guru of the fantasy world, because you're our only hope, Obi-Wan.
yeah, I wouldn't put too much hope or too much faith in me either. But you, t in addition to those things, you toss on top of it the emotions that are just right at the boiling point
Yeah.
for everybody, at least all the chase contenders. And you've got the recipe for excitement or chaos, depending on your perspective. I mean, just remember, it was only a couple of years back that Jeff Gordon knocked Clint Boyer well into the wall, setting up a green-white checkered finish after those two had problems earlier in the season.
Yeah.
And that was before, and that was nothing like what we see right now. You've got a number of drivers that are probably gunning for Keselowski. You got a number of drivers that, if they go after Keselowski, could become collateral damage. You got Harvick and Kenseth that don't particularly like each other right now, and Harvick doesn't want to see Kenseth make it to the final round if he can't. And if Harvick doesn't win, you got a tight enough points battle that he could make it on points, but probably won't. So he's got to be up there battling for the victory or keep himself in position. If he falls out, then you've got that catalyst. So I think it's right to be confused. I think in the best of times, the Phoenix Fall race is a little difficult to predict. It's a short flat track. It should have great streaks, and it does. But you can't always tell how a driver is going to run in the fall based on how they ran in the spring, unless they've got a long streak of strong runs. So a Jimmy Johnson, a Kyle Busch, a Kevin Harvick, you can expect them to run well in the fall after they ran well in the spring, but only because they've got the rest of their career kind of backing them up. Here we've got the second race of the season and the second to last race of the season. So you've got two totally different scenarios. You've got drivers on different agendas. By this time of year, you definitely have each individual driver has a different agenda at the beginning and at the end. And when you get to this part of the season, you've got drivers who are on different agendas for the global picture. They're either starting to look towards next year, or they're racing for the chase, or they're racing for their careers, trying to make sure that they get a good finish before decisions get made over the Christmas break or over the winter break. So I think at the best of times, this is a difficult track a difficult race to handicap. Next spring ends up being a lot easier because it's both closer on the calendar, and drivers carry momentum from this race to the spring better than they do from the spring to the fall.
Yeah, I wonder if anybody will hold off on their vengeance until the spring race. Well, I guess we won't know that until sometime early Sunday evening. But one thing I think we probably can both agree on is for salary cap game players, there is kind of an easy pick down at the bottom of the salary this week, as Ty Dillon is going to start in one of those RCR cars, probably one of the A series RCR cars.
Yeah, and that team comes in two versions: when they've got an RCR driver behind the wheel, and when they've got David Strimmy, Travis Kvapil, whoever else they put in the car. And so they'll get the A car this week. They didn't do great here in the spring with Brian Scott behind the wheel, but there's a difference between having Ty Dillon, Richard Childress's grandson, and having Brian Scott behind the wheel. And Dillon did very well in his debut at Atlanta, finished 25th. Scott, I think, finished 32nd. So if you find a finish anywhere between 25th and 32nd, that still makes them a good salary cap play. It's got to be a bargain basement driver. Probably wasn't added to most games until the Atlanta race. Probably was added at whatever the minimum price is for that, and then didn't get bumped a lot based on that 25th place finish because don't know if it's going to stick around. So he's an easy pick. Then you've got other drivers that are situationally good on short flat tracks, and those are going to be pretty good picks as well. Austin Dillon has been doing pretty well on short flat tracks. His last 2 efforts were top 15s. His last 4 were top 20s. Most of his runs on the minimum length courses have been in the top 20, and now he's got the added incentive of having Ty in the race and wanting to do better than his brother. So if Ty finishes somewhere around 25th to 30th, Austin's going to want to finish somewhere in that top 20 to top 15 range if he possibly can. So that's going to help out a little bit.
So maybe we'll have brothers wrecking each other too. Let's just throw that into the whole mix with everything else that's going on.
Could have that. You've always got that possibility with Kyle and Kurt Busch too.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Those two don't. They race each other harder when they get around each other than anybody else in the field. Yeah. So I think you've got some, and then you've got a couple of hometown guys that could run a little bit better than normal. You got Alex Bowman. He's had a handful of decent runs on short flat tracks, that being top 30s. He didn't do particularly well here in the spring, but I think he had some sort of issue. So he could do a little bit better this week. Really, the Phoenix driver is going to be in the number 83 car this week. So he should be doing a little bit better than he's done in the past. So you've got some good bargain basement drivers. This week, I think probably the best thing to do is start at the bottom. Try to identify those really cheap drivers, and then see what you have left over for drivers near the top.
How much? I had a question I was going to ask you there, and I kind of lost my train of thought. I may have to come back to it, but yeah, it's just it's totally gone. So it'll come back. I didn't know how to interrupt you when it came into my head, and now I forgot. So.
I describe that as I have these little blank spots, these little blank bubbles that float around in my brain, and every now and then one floats to the front, and I just shut down for a moment. So I get that. Then when you jump up to the top of the list, I think you've got a couple of drivers that should do well. They're also chasers, and that's going to be really difficult to predict this week. Kevin Harvick having 3 wins and another second-place finish in his last 5 races here, including back-to-back victories last fall and this spring. I think it's going to be a surprise if he's not challenging for the win. Predicting wins is difficult, so he might not get the victory, but there was no question about how strong he was going to be in the Profit 500K this spring. So there's probably not going to be any question about how well he's going to run by the time the green flag waves over the Quicken Loans Race for Heroes 500K. Jeff Gordon has to have a strong run, but even if he finishes second and one of those guys below him wins the race, he doesn't control his own destiny. So he can't afford to race conservatively. That's not necessarily good for him. This isn't one of his better tracks overall, although he's been good here in the past. He's got victories here in the past. But in the last 6 races or so, his average finish is relatively low. Part of it's skewed by that crash with Clint Boyer. You've got Jimmy Johnson, who, if you only watch the last 3 AAA Texas 500s, the fall races there, you wouldn't know that he had any problems whatsoever. So I think we're going to feel that same way at the end of Phoenix. You go back 16 races, he's got 14 top 6 finishes. just narrowly missed making 14 top fives this spring when he finished sixth. So the two runs that he had that were outside that mark have been in recent seasons, and that if he didn't run well at Texas last week, that probably would make me think that he isn't a good value this week. But since he did, he possibly got that monkey off his back. And Casey Kane is actually pretty strong here too. He's got a good 3-year average finish on this track. He's among the top 10 in 3-year average finishes. He needs to win as well. He's one of those drivers that really needs to go into the off season with some success because he's got Chase Elliott breathing down his neck, and a lot of those decisions get made pretty early in the season. So he wants Rick Hendrick feeling good about him all through 2015, beginning at Christmas time, because his contract comes up at the end of next year. A lot of what's happened to Kane has been bad luck, and a lot of it's been, once you get into that downward spiral, it's just easy to keep wrecking. And I think he's wrecked 5 or 6 times in the last 2 races. Been involved in 5 or 6 accidents. So that's hard to shake sometimes, but he's got a good run here. I'd say if you got a good shot, if you picked a Hendrick Motorsports driver to win, you've got a better than average shot that one of them is going to find victory lane.
One of the things that I finally remembered what I was going to ask you about. I know we're late, very late in the season. Obviously, 2 races to go in the Sprint Cup season, and people are maybe have a chance to jockey for a championship at this point. This is where you've got to look. If you're trailing, you got to have a strategy that's different than if you're leading, right? Maybe touch on that a little bit before we switch over and talk about the Yahoo game specifically.
Well, you're going to look for those differentiators, and you're not going to be as scared by drivers who are inconsistent. So Kyle Busch last week, I called him out before the race started. I lost a little confidence in him before the race, before the green flag waved, and ultimately he ended up with a good finish. He's got those kinds of seesaw records on tracks. He's got those kind of seesaw races. But where that would scare you off earlier in the season, now, if your competition's not taking him, if he's not very popular in the game that you're playing, he makes a good pick because he could finish in the top 5 or wreck. But if he finishes in the top 5, he's probably not going to bring your competition up with him. Dale Earnhardt Jr., I think, is probably another good differentiator. Not the first driver you think of when we come to Phoenix. He had a strong group of results back at the beginning of his career, and then went something like, I don't have the number right in front of me, but something like 17 races without another top 5 until last spring. Then he finished 5th, finished 4th in the fall, finished 2nd this spring. So he's now got a top 5 streak going.
And a win at Martinsville. A couple weeks back on another flat short track too. So.
Yep. And so he's got the most recent momentum where that's concerned. So he's not going to completely fly under the radar, but he could be one of those drivers that is not on the majority of rosters. So I think he makes a good differentiator. And then stay away from the drivers that are the most popular. Everybody thinks Kevin Harvick's going to win. If you have to make up ground, you really have to roll the dice and not take Kevin Harvick and hope that something happens to him.
Hope that Keselowski finds him in the race.
Or Jeff Gordon can't be real happy with him right at the moment either, because he lost during this week because of Kevin's Harvicking, I think is what the Twitter hashtag is.
Yeah.
Although I did say, and kudos to Kevin for this. I saw that Harvick intends to pay the fines for all the crew members. That doesn't put him back in the pits, though.
No, that's nice of him to do. But he's got more money than those guys do, so he can afford it. Well, before we switch gears and go to strictly talking about the Yahoo game, I want to remind people that you can. Dan Beaver is, the online resident fantasy racing guru, and you can read Dan's very detailed reports at yahoosports.com for both the Yahoo game in general and then the practice and qualifying report that comes out a day or so later. and then also read Dan's unique content at rotoworld.com as well. So we've got all that stuff going this weekend, and you can check out our hangout every week on generally on Thursdays, the week before the race, or the Thursday before the race, to get these last minute audio talks, video talks about it. So okay, so we're going to the Yahoo game. What's the plan there this week?
Kind of the same thing. If you're trailing, you're going to have to avoid Kevin Harvick and Jeff Gordon in Group A. But if you're not, if you're looking to protect a lead, then they're going to be the most popular drivers. They're the drivers that you're going to want on your roster. Look and see who's trending up, and it doesn't change a whole lot between Thursday night and Friday morning. Tonight's the night you want to look, and you probably want the drivers that are the most popular that are available to you. Then watch practice. Try to make sure that you get the right 50% of those drivers activated and the right 50% on your bench. Look, without having seen any weekend stuff yet, I think Harvick, Gordon, Johnson have got to be three of the favorites to win the race or to finish in the top five. I think the top five will probably be dominated by the top five will be dominated by Group A drivers. So you really want to make that pick. You want to get that pick right, if at all possible. But if you need to make up ground, Jimmy Johnson probably is still not particularly popular because of the struggles that he had. Jimmy Johnson makes a good pick. So perhaps you want a Kevin Harvick and a Johnson on your roster, or a Gordon and an Earnhardt on your roster. So you've got one driver that is probably favored to finish in the top five, and another who has something that doesn't recommend them. You get down to Group B, and at this point, if you're like me, you're probably just managing your allocations. Denny Hamlin, I've got ranked number one right at the moment. He's a good short flat track racer. He's got a different agenda this week. He shares the point lead with Joey Logano. So all he needs to do to advance to Homestead is to finish in the top 10. He should be able to finish in the top 10 at Phoenix in his sleep. So that's what that team's going to be going for. They're not going to gamble to try to get a victory, which could end up biting them in the end, or probably won't. So they're a good, safe pick because they're probably going to finish somewhere around the 10th place mark. Ryan Newman, again, a very consistent driver, always consistent. So if you've got an allocation available for him, if you don't and you're looking for that differentiator, Tony Stewart could be a good, an interesting pick this week. His fourth place finish at Martinsville 2 weeks ago is probably the biggest reason to recommend him, but just missing the top 10 last week at Texas was another solid run for that organization. And an 11th place finish at this stage of the season in Group B, if you're out of Keselowski and Logano, is good. Keselowski's got the second best average running position over the past 6 races. Joey Logano doesn't, but he's been strong since he moved into the Joe Gibbs car. So they're going to be good, but whether or not that helps you out depends on what's going on with your roster. Then we get down to Group C. I think we've got the Dillon brothers that factor in there as well. Ty could get a 20th place finish, somewhere in that range. Could get a top 25, and that could make him a decent pick. Short of that, Cole Witt had a strong run here in the spring. He finished 27th. This is a track that rewards driver skill to a greater degree than unrestricted intermediate speedways do, where the horsepower has to be there as well. So you get those kinds of strong runs. I just saw a greyhound walk behind me.
That's right. It gives us some gravitas when we're talking about racing, man. That's right. We had the cat on pit row earlier this week, so might as well have the dog on the pit stop.
Yeah, my life is all about racing. My pets are even greyhounds. So.
There you go. Perfect.
So if you're going to take a risk on someone this week versus next down in Group C, if you have one allocation for either Larson or Dillon, you would probably rather start one of the other drivers here at Phoenix because it's a driver's track, and then save that marquee driver, Larson or Dillon, for next week at Homestead. So even though we've only got 2 weeks remaining, you still have to be thinking in terms of allocation management.
And by the way, my pets are Shih Tzus, so that tells you a little bit about what my life's about. But
Yep.
any final thoughts before we let this one go? I mean, I know we've talked about this a lot this week, and everybody has. This is going to be a very, very interesting race at Phoenix. I'm not sure it's interesting for those who have to predict it, but it's going to be interesting to watch, I think.
And it's not going to be interesting for those that are in the top 8 in points. That race last week just totally inverted, pulled the field right back together. They're going to be going through the same emotions they went through at Talladega, with the possible exception of Logano, Hamlin, and Newman, who only need top 10 finishes in order to advance, because only one guy's going to win. Only one guy's going to get there based on victories. So 3 are going to get there on points. And those guys, normally you wouldn't think that was a very good points buffer, 13 and 11 points. Could be enough this week. Someone like Gordon, actually anybody below those 3, Gordon on down, they've got to be thinking in terms of, if I can't win, another non-chaser has to be there, and I've got to make up. I've got to finish in the top 5.
Yeah.
So it's going to push them to the front. Even if it doesn't get them the victory, it probably will get them strong runs. What I wouldn't do necessarily this week is take Brad Keselowski. Even if the other drivers that are lined up to pay him back don't actually turn him, they could provide enough of a distraction that this is not one of his 9 best races for Yahoo, or makes him a good salary cap play. They could knock him out of the top 10. And there are all sorts of ways to get a driver out of your way. And wrecking them isn't the only one that matters. And if everybody races Keselowski as aggressively as he has raced them, then he's going to have a hard time getting to the front.
Yeah, there's so many sub stories here that so I say I think this is the most interesting race that I can remember in maybe ever, at least. And usually when that happens, it becomes a disappointing, boring parade. And hopefully that's not the case this week. We'll see. So he is Dan Beaver. Make sure you follow Dan on Twitter at Fantasy Race. Follow me on Twitter at On Pit Row. We'll be back next Thursday to talk about the fantasy implications of the last race of the season, which will be at Homestead Miami Speedway. That'll be interesting too. But we won't really know. We can't even talk about that at all at this point, I don't think, until after Sunday.
Yeah, who's in the chase is gonna impact that considerably.
All right. Well, Dan, have a great weekend. Enjoy the race. I'm sure I'll be talking to you between now and next Tuesday or whatever. And folks, we'll talk to you. Thanks for joining us this week. Leave some comments for us. Tell us what you'd like to see on these broadcasts, and we'll try to accommodate you. So thanks.